The courthouse doors explode open. A man in a federal badge strides in as Judge Randolph Chambers slams his gavel down with satisfaction. 5 years in state prison. No parole for 2 years, the judge declares, staring down at the black teenager in handcuffs. 17-year-old Darius Blackwell's head drops in despair. His first offense just earned him a sentence that would destroy his future. "Your Honor, this seems excessive," his overwhelmed public defender begins. "The sentence stands," Judge Chambers snaps. "This court won't coddle young criminals." That's when the federal official's voice cuts through the room like a blade. "Your Honor, there's been a grave miscarriage of justice here." Judge Chambers freezes mid-celebration. Every eye turns to the man, with unmistakable authority, approaching the bench. "Attorney General Vincent Blackwell, Department of Justice," the man announces, his voice carrying absolute power. "And you just sentenced my son." The courtroom erupts. The teenager the judge thought he could railroad without consequences isn't just any kid from the system. He's the Attorney General's son, and justice is about to be served. 6 hours earlier, Darius Blackwell had been reviewing calculus homework in his bedroom, preparing for his final exams as a senior at Cumberland High School. At 17, he maintained a 3.8 GPA, served as student council treasurer, and had already received early admission to Duke University with a partial academic scholarship. He had dreams of studying political science before going to law school, following the footsteps of both of his parents. His father, Attorney General Vincent Blackwell, had been appointed to the position just 8 months earlier, after a long and distinguished career as a federal prosecutor. When the governor called, offering the position, Vincent knew it was the culmination of decades of hard work. For the family, it meant leaving behind the familiar rhythms of Washington, D.C., and moving to North Carolina. The relocation had forced Darius to transfer schools during his senior year, an experience that might have unsettled most teenagers. But he had adjusted quickly, joining clubs, running for student council, and earning the respect of his teachers and peers. The Blackwell family represented what many people called the American dream. Vincent had grown up in a tough Detroit neighborhood, raised by a single mother after his father abandoned the family. He had taken shifts at a local auto plant while studying at Wayne State, often sleeping in the library to save on heating bills. Law school had been even harder, but he persevered, determined to build a better future for himself and his siblings. His wife, Michelle, came from a different background, the daughter of a college professor and a public school teacher. She had built her own successful career as a corporate attorney, proving herself in a field still dominated by men. Together, Vincent and Michelle had worked tirelessly to create a home filled with stability, discipline, and love. Darius had inherited both his father's strong sense of justice and his mother's analytical mind. Teachers often remarked that he seemed older than his years, the kind of student who not only excelled academically, but also looked out for others. When a freshman was bullied for his stutter, Darius had stepped in to defend him, later tutoring the boy in math after school. He volunteered at the local food bank every Saturday morning, sometimes dragging along his younger sister Jasmine to instill the same spirit of service. In many ways, Darius was a model teenager, the kind of young man neighbors held up as proof that dedication and discipline could overcome hardship. His future seemed mapped out. Graduation was less than 3 weeks away. Duke University awaited in the fall. He dreamed of becoming a prosecutor like his father, perhaps even serving in public office one day. Darius believed in the system because he had grown up seeing his father use it to deliver justice. What he did not know was that the same system could just as easily turn against him, regardless of his grades, his ambition, or his character. That afternoon, Darius left the house to buy supplies for a school project. The task was simple: poster board and markers for his American government presentation on civil rights. He told his mother he would be back in 15 minutes. Michelle barely looked up from the contract she was reviewing in her home office. reminding him to be careful crossing the busy intersection near the corner store. Arthur Patel's convenience store was only 3 blocks away. A small neighborhood business with bright yellow signage and a narrow aisle, stocked with everything from cereal boxes to batteries. Arthur knew Darius by name, often asking about his plans for college and joking about how one day he expected to see him on television as a senator or judge. Unlike some teenagers who came through the store, Darius was polite, never causing trouble, and always respectful. At exactly 3:47 in the afternoon, Darius stepped inside, wearing his Cumberland High Letterman jacket. He had earned it not for sports, but for 4 years of dedication to the academic decathlon team. His wallet, with his student ID tucked inside, bulged slightly in his pocket. He selected a pack of markers and a sheet of poster board, paid in cash, and thanked Arthur before heading out. What Darius did not know was that only 2 hours earlier, the same store had been robbed. The suspect was described as a young black male wearing dark clothing. The actual robber had already been caught 6 miles away, but that update had not reached every patrol unit. Officer Ryan Duggan was one of the officers still operating under the old alert. He was relatively new to the force, eager to prove himself, and influenced heavily by the department's push for proactive policing in neighborhoods labeled as higher risk. Duggan had received a call from a neighbor who reported seeing a suspicious young man walking in the area. The neighbor had noticed Darius pass by with his backpack and assumed he matched the robbery description. When Duggan spotted Darius leaving the store with a bag in hand, the pieces fit together too neatly in his mind. He saw not an honest student but a potential suspect. His assumptions, built on incomplete information and unconscious bias, hardened into certainty before he even turned on his cruiser lights. It was a convergence of miscommunication, racial profiling, and the eagerness of a young officer determined to make his mark. In that moment, the narrative of Darius Blackwell as a promising honor student shifted in Duggan's eyes into something entirely different, a threat to be neutralized. As Darius walked home, his mind was still on his project. He rehearsed the opening lines of his presentation about the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause, planning to connect historic cases like Brown versus Board of Education with modern challenges. He thought about how proud his father would be to see him standing at the podium, speaking confidently about justice and fairness, but his real education in constitutional law was about to begin, not in the classroom, but in the most painful and personal way possible. Because while Darius believed in the fairness of the law, Officer Duggan believed he had just spotted a criminal, and in the minutes that followed, their two realities would collide with devastating consequences. Far away in Washington, D.C., Vincent Blackwell sat in a conference room at the Department of Justice, reviewing evidence in a major corruption probe. Surrounded by senior staff and stacks of briefing papers, he had no idea that at that very moment his son was about to become a victim of the very injustices he had spent his career fighting to dismantle. Officer Ryan Duggan pulled his patrol car alongside Darius as the teenager walked home, the afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the quiet residential street. Duggan had been dispatched to investigate a report of a suspicious person. The description had been vague, offered by a neighbor who claimed they had seen a young man loitering near the corner store. The caller's motivations were questionable, but Duggan, eager to prove himself, treated the tip as credible. "Excuse me, son," Duggan called out, rolling down his window. "I need to speak with you." Darius slowed his pace and turned, confusion flickering across his face. His parents had drilled into him the rules for encounters like this. Stay calm, stay polite, comply with reasonable requests, and remember that his words and actions would be judged more harshly than those of his white classmates. He carefully set his bag on the ground and kept his hands visible. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" he asked respectfully. Duggan stepped out of his vehicle, his hand resting on his service weapon in a gesture that betrayed caution more than necessity. Before him stood a teenager wearing a Cumberland High School letterman jacket and carrying poster board. The boy looked more like a student preparing for finals than a criminal suspect. Yet Dugan's training had warned him that appearances could be deceiving, and his own assumptions filled in the rest. There was a robbery at the corner store about an hour ago, Dugan said, though his timeline was off by nearly an hour. The suspect matched your description. I'm going to need to see some identification and search that bag. The request was legally shaky. The actual robbery had taken place 2 hours earlier, and the suspect had already been caught miles away. Dugan had not been updated, and without reasonable suspicion, his demand for a search was on fragile ground. Still, Darius remembered his parents' warnings. Never argue in the street. Of course, officer, he said calmly. Here is my student ID and driver's license. I was just buying supplies for a school project. Mr. Patel at the store can confirm that. Darius handed over the IDs slowly, every movement deliberate, so the officer would not misinterpret his actions. Dugan studied the identification. Clean record. 17 years old. Local address. Everything about the documents matched the boy's story, yet Dugan felt a nagging suspicion. In his mind, polite behavior could just as easily be part of a cover. I am still going to need to search that bag, Dugan pressed, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Darius hesitated. He knew his rights. The Fourth Amendment did not allow warrantless searches without cause. But he also knew that asserting those rights in this moment could make matters worse. His father's voice echoed in his mind. Stay alive first. Argue the law later. Officer, I understand you are doing your job, Darius replied carefully. But I have not done anything wrong. These are just school supplies. The response was measured, logical, and true. Yet Dugan bristled. Instead of recognizing the boy's knowledge as evidence of maturity, he interpreted it as defiance. His authority felt challenged. Are you refusing to cooperate with a police investigation? Dugan demanded. No, sir. I'm cooperating fully, Darius answered, his voice steady. I'm just asking what specific crime you suspect me of committing. The question landed like a stone in a still pond. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly lawful, yet in Dugan's mind it was an attack. He had not expected this teenager to speak with such clarity about constitutional rights. Frustration surged through him, mingled with insecurity. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, Dugan snapped. You are under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting arrest. The charges were baseless. Darius had resisted nothing, obstructed nothing. But the moment the words left the officer's mouth, the machinery of the justice system clicked into motion. Dugan cuffed him, cold steel biting into his wrists. Sir, please, Darius protested, his voice calm but urgent. I am not resisting. I've done nothing wrong. Silence, Dugan barked. The poster board slipped from Darius's grasp and fluttered to the pavement, bright markers scattering across the sidewalk. His presentation on civil rights, the 14th Amendment, and the promise of equal protection lay strewn in pieces at his feet. The irony was cruel, almost theatrical. A woman across the street peeked out from her porch, clutching her phone but uncertain whether to intervene. A delivery driver slowed his van, watching as the teenager was pressed against the hood of the patrol car. Whispers carried through the neighborhood. The story already spreading before Darius had even been driven away. Dugan radioed in the arrest, framing the incident in the language of police procedure. Suspect detained for obstruction, non-compliant during stop. The phrasing would shape the official narrative long before Darius could speak for himself. Inside the back of the patrol car, Darius sat rigid, heart pounding, mind racing. He thought about his parents. His father was in Washington, handling corruption cases that threatened to shake political foundations. His mother was in her office downtown, preparing briefs for corporate litigation. Neither had the faintest idea that their son was being booked into county jail. He thought about Duke University, the scholarship letter he had pinned above his desk, the dreams of becoming an attorney. All of it felt fragile now, like glass shattering with each passing second. At the station, the booking process moved mechanically. Mugshots, fingerprints, intake forms. The officers processing him looked at his ID and raised eyebrows. Honor student. Clean record. Yet none of that stopped the paperwork. Once an arrest was made, the system pushed forward like a train on rails. By the time Darius was placed in a holding cell, the weight of the situation pressed on him fully. His poster board was gone, his presentation ruined, and his record, once spotless, was now stained with charges that carried serious implications. In that dim, echoing cell, he replayed the encounter in his mind. He had done everything right, followed every rule his parents had taught him. He had been polite, cooperative, and calm. Yet still he sat behind bars. Outside, Cumberland County buzzed with rumors. Some whispered that the Attorney General's son had been arrested, others that a student had been wrongfully accused. None of the speculation captured the deeper truth, that this was not about one boy, one officer, or one arrest. It was about the prejudices and assumptions woven into the system itself, and as Darius waited, staring at the grey walls of the holding cell, he realized that his real education in constitutional law was only beginning. The lessons would not come from textbooks or classroom debates. They would come from the courtroom of Judge Chambers, from prosecutors eager to prove themselves, and from a community divided over whether justice was truly blind. The poster board had been meant for a school project. Instead, his life itself had become the case study. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Cumberland County Justice Center processed Darius like any other arrestee, despite the obvious problems with Officer Duggan's arrest. The intake officer, following standard procedures, confiscated Darius's belongings and placed him in a holding cell with several adult offenders awaiting arraignment. For 6 hours, Darius sat in the overcrowded cell, surrounded by men facing charges ranging from drunk and disorderly conduct to assault. His Letterman jacket had been taken during processing, replaced with standard orange detention clothing that marked him as just another criminal in the system's eyes. "First time?" asked Marcus, a man in his 30s who had been arrested for violating parole. He had noticed Darius's obvious distress and the way the teenager kept checking the clock, clearly expecting someone to come for him. "This is all a mistake," Darius replied quietly. "I was just buying school supplies. My father will straighten this out as soon as he gets back from Washington." Marcus nodded sympathetically. He had heard similar statements from countless young men who believed the system would recognize their innocence and treat them fairly. "Kid, the system doesn't care about mistakes. It cares about convictions. You better hope your daddy's got a good lawyer." The arraignment process began at 9 p.m., with defendants being called before Judge Chambers in the order they had been processed. Darius watched as case after case was disposed of quickly. Plea bargains, sentence reductions, and the occasional dismissal for defendants whose families could afford experienced attorneys. When public defender Jessica Novak was assigned to Darius's case, she had exactly 7 minutes to review his file before they were called before the judge. Novak was handling 43 active cases and was running on 3 hours of sleep, making thorough preparation impossible. "Darius, I see this is your first arrest," she said hurriedly. "The prosecutor is offering a plea deal, 6 months probation and community service." "I recommend taking it, but I didn't do anything wrong," Darius protested. "Officer Duggan had no reason to arrest me. This whole thing is based on a misunderstanding." Novak sighed, recognizing the idealism of a young person encountering the system for the first time. "Kid, fighting these charges could mean months in jail awaiting trial. Judge Chambers doesn't like defendants who claim innocence when the evidence says otherwise." What Novak didn't explain was that evidence in this case consisted entirely of Officer Duggan's report, which contained multiple inaccuracies and unsupported assumptions. She also didn't mention Judge Chambers' reputation for harsh sentences, particularly for young black defendants. When they entered the courtroom, Prosecutor Victoria Ashmore was already prepared with an aggressive narrative that transformed Darius from student to predator. She had reviewed his case for less than 5 minutes, but had constructed a story that would resonate with Judge Chambers' prejudices. "Your Honor," Ashmore began, "this defendant was caught in the vicinity of a recent robbery, carrying suspicious items, and became combative when questioned by police. His refusal to cooperate with the investigation demonstrates a pattern of disrespect for law enforcement that requires serious consequences." Every element of her statement was misleading or false, but the rapid pace of arraignment court meant there was no time for detailed fact-checking or cross-examination. Judge Chambers, who had developed strong opinions about problem youth over his 20-year career, saw exactly what he expected to see: a young black defendant with an attitude problem who needed to be taught respect for authority. The stage was set for a miscarriage of justice that would have destroyed Darius's future if not for his father's unexpected arrival. While Darius sat in Cumberland County lockup, Attorney General Vincent Blackwell was conducting emergency meetings at the Department of Justice headquarters in Washington, D.C. A major corruption investigation involving several federal judges had reached a critical phase, requiring his personal oversight and coordination with multiple agencies. The meetings had run late into the evening, with Vincent's phone on silent mode to avoid interruptions during sensitive discussions about ongoing investigations. His security detail maintained standard protocols, monitoring communications but filtering non-emergency messages to avoid compromising operational security. At 11:30 p.m., Vincent finally checked his messages and found 17 missed calls from his wife, Michelle, along with increasingly frantic text messages about Darius being arrested. The messages painted a confusing picture. Their honor student son was apparently facing serious charges for a robbery he couldn't have committed. "Leonard," Vincent said to his deputy, "I need to get to North Carolina immediately. There's a family emergency." Deputy Attorney General Leonard Shaw recognized the gravity in his boss's voice and immediately began coordinating federal transportation. Within 30 minutes, a Justice Department jet was being prepared for an emergency flight to North Carolina. During the flight, Vincent spoke with Michelle and began piecing together what had happened. The arrest report made no sense. Darius had been at home doing homework when the original robbery occurred, and multiple witnesses could verify his whereabouts throughout the afternoon. More troubling was Michelle's description of the charges and the court-appointed attorney's advice to accept a plea deal. Vincent recognized the signs of a system railroad job, the kind of prosecutorial overreach he had spent his career fighting against. "This is exactly what we've been investigating in other districts," Vincent told Shaw over the secure phone connection. "Overzealous prosecution, inadequate defense representation, and judges who prioritize conviction rates over justice." Shaw pulled up Cumberland County's judicial statistics while Vincent flew south. What he found was disturbing. Judge Chambers' conviction rate was 97%, with sentencing patterns that showed clear disparities based on race and socioeconomic status. "Vincent, this judge has been flagged by civil rights organizations for years," Shaw reported. "His sentences for young black defendants are consistently 40% higher than state averages for comparable crimes." The data confirmed Vincent's worst fears. His son hadn't just been arrested on bogus charges. He was about to face a judge with a documented history of discriminatory sentencing. Meanwhile, Civil Rights Monitor Dr. Philip Lane was conducting a routine review of sentencing disparities in North Carolina courts when Cumberland County's statistics caught his attention. Judge Chambers' numbers were so far outside normal ranges that they suggested systematic bias rather than coincidental patterns. Lane had been tracking similar cases across the Southeast, building documentation for a potential federal intervention in districts where local justice systems had failed to provide equal protection under law. "We've got another problem, Judge," Lane told his supervisor. "Cumberland County needs immediate federal oversight." The conversation was taking place just as Vincent's plane was touching down in North Carolina, though Lane had no idea that the Attorney General was about to personally confront the judicial bias his office had been investigating. The convergence of federal oversight, statistical evidence, and parental outrage was creating the perfect opportunity to expose systematic injustice in Cumberland County's courts. Vincent Blackwell's arrival at Cumberland County Courthouse at 6 a.m. triggered a carefully orchestrated federal response that had been months in the planning. His son's case provided the personal catalyst, but the Justice Department had been building systematic cases against biased courts throughout the region. "Sure, activate the Cumberland County investigation immediately," Vincent ordered during the drive from the airport. "I want federal monitors, civil rights investigators, and complete documentation of every case Judge Chambers has heard in the past 2 years." Deputy Attorney General Shaw coordinated the response from Washington, mobilizing resources that had been prepared for exactly this type of intervention. Within hours, federal investigators would descend on Cumberland County with the authority to review court records, interview participants, and document constitutional violations. Vincent's first stop was the jail, where he found Darius in a holding cell designed for hardened criminals, not honor students awaiting arraignment. The sight of his son in orange detention clothing, surrounded by adult offenders, intensified his determination to expose the system's failures. "Dad, I didn't do anything wrong," Darius said quietly. "They arrested me for buying school supplies." Vincent embraced his son through the cell bars, his prosecutorial mind already cataloguing the legal violations he was witnessing. "I know, son. This is going to be fixed properly." Meanwhile, FBI Director Catherine Vale was reviewing Shaw's preliminary report on Judge Chambers' sentencing patterns. The statistical evidence was damning, clear disparities that indicated systematic discrimination rather than individual bias. "We need to treat this as a civil rights investigation with potential criminal implications," Vale told Shaw. "If federal law enforcement personnel are participating in discriminatory prosecutions, that's a felony." The conversation was taking place while Vincent prepared for the morning court session, where Judge Chambers expected to process Darius's case as routine business. Instead, the judge was about to face federal scrutiny that would end his career and transform Cumberland County's approach to justice. U.S. Marshal Commander Douglas Webb received orders to provide security for federal personnel conducting the investigation. His team positioned agents throughout the courthouse, though their presence was discreet enough to avoid alerting local officials to the scope of federal interest. Civil rights investigator Dr. Philip Lane arrived in Cumberland County with a team of federal attorneys and statisticians, prepared to document systematic violations and recommend federal intervention in the court system. "This isn't just about one case or one judge," Lane explained to his team. "This is about a pattern of constitutional violations that requires comprehensive federal oversight." Journalist Madison Harper, covering courthouse activities for the regional newspaper, noticed the unusual federal presence and began investigating what was clearly a significant story developing. Her inquiries led her to discover Vincent Blackwell's overnight arrival and his son's detention, though she didn't yet understand the full implications of the attorney general personally confronting a judge with documented bias issues. The strategic response Vincent had orchestrated would transform his son's individual case into a comprehensive federal investigation that would protect countless future defendants from similar injustice. The moment Attorney General Blackwell announced his identity in Judge Chambers' courtroom, the entire dynamic of Cumberland County's justice system shifted permanently. Federal authority had arrived to confront local prejudice, and the confrontation would be swift and decisive. Judge Chambers, who had been smugly satisfied with his harsh sentence just moments before, suddenly found himself facing the most powerful law enforcement official in the United States. His confident demeanor evaporated as he realized the magnitude of his error. "Mr. Attorney General," Chambers stammered, "I had no idea. If I had known the defendant's family connections—" "That's exactly the problem," Vincent interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had prosecuted corruption cases for decades. "Justice should not depend on family connections. Your Honor, it should be blind to race, class, and political influence." The packed courtroom watched in stunned silence as the most powerful judge in the county faced federal accountability. Prosecutor Victoria Ashmore, who had aggressively pushed for harsh sentencing just minutes earlier, now looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. Public defender Jessica Novak, who had advised Darius to accept a plea deal for crimes he didn't commit, suddenly understood that she was witnessing a federal intervention that would reshape how justice was administered in Cumberland County. "Furthermore," Vincent continued, "this court is now under federal investigation for systematic violations of constitutional rights. I have teams of civil rights investigators reviewing every case you've heard in the past 2 years. The revelation sent shockwaves through the local legal community. Court personnel who had enabled discriminatory practices suddenly realized they faced potential federal prosecution for civil rights violations." Vincent approached the defendant's table where his son sat in handcuffs, the orange detention uniform, a stark contrast to the honor student's usual appearance. "Darius, I'm sorry this happened to you, but we're going to use this experience to make sure it never happens to anyone else." Deputy Attorney General Shaw entered the courtroom with a team of federal investigators, their presence making clear that this was not simply a family matter, but a federal law enforcement operation. "Your Honor," Shaw announced, "the Department of Justice is assuming oversight of this case and conducting a comprehensive review of Cumberland County's judicial practices." Judge Chambers realized his career was over. 20 years of discriminatory sentencing, enabled by a system that had never held him accountable, was about to face federal scrutiny that would expose every constitutional violation. Court Administrator Ruth Crane, who had facilitated the biased system through administrative procedures, began calculating her own legal exposure as federal investigators took control of court records and computer systems. The power shift was complete and irreversible. What had begun as a routine arraignment designed to railroad an innocent teenager had become a federal civil rights investigation that would transform how justice was administered throughout the region. Vincent helped remove Darius's handcuffs personally, a symbolic moment that demonstrated how federal authority could protect constitutional rights when local systems failed. "Dad," Darius said quietly, "is this what justice looks like?" "This is what accountability looks like," Vincent replied. "Justice is what comes next." Within 72 hours of Attorney General Blackwell's intervention, Cumberland County's justice system underwent the most comprehensive federal investigation in its history. The consequences were swift, systematic, and designed to prevent future constitutional violations. Judge Randolph Chambers faced immediate suspension from judicial duties pending investigation by the North Carolina Judicial Standards Commission. Federal investigators had documented over 200 cases showing clear sentencing disparities based on race, with Chambers consistently imposing harsher punishments on minority defendants for identical crimes. Judge Chambers' sentencing patterns constitute a clear violation of the Equal Protection Clause. civil rights investigator Dr. Philip Lane explained during a federal press conference. The statistical evidence of bias is overwhelming and requires immediate intervention. Prosecutor Victoria Ashmore found herself under federal investigation for civil rights violations after records revealed her practice of seeking disproportionately harsh sentences for minority defendants. Her aggressive prosecution of Darius, despite obvious problems with the arrest, exemplified the systematic prosecutorial misconduct that had infected the county's legal system. The Cumberland County District Attorney's Office was placed under federal monitoring, with all plea negotiations and sentencing recommendations subject to review by Department of Justice attorneys. The oversight would continue until the office demonstrated consistent adherence to constitutional standards. Officer Ryan Duggan faced termination and potential federal charges after investigators determined his arrest of Darius violated clearly established constitutional rights. The arrest report contained multiple false statements designed to justify an arrest that lacked probable cause. Officer Duggan's conduct represents exactly the kind of discriminatory policing that federal civil rights laws were designed to prevent, FBI Director Catherine Vail announced. Law enforcement officers who violate citizens' constitutional rights will face federal prosecution. The Cumberland County Police Department implemented comprehensive retraining programs focusing on constitutional policing and bias awareness. Federal monitors would evaluate all arrests involving minority suspects to ensure compliance with civil rights standards. Public Defender Jessica Novak, while not facing criminal charges, was required to undergo additional training in constitutional criminal defense. Her advice to Darius to accept a plea deal for crimes he didn't commit reflected the systemic inadequacy of legal representation for indigent defendants. The state allocated additional funding for public defender offices, reducing caseloads and ensuring adequate representation for all defendants regardless of their ability to pay for private attorneys. Most significantly, the investigation revealed systematic record-keeping problems that had hidden discriminatory practices for years. Federal authorities implemented new reporting requirements that would make bias patterns immediately visible to oversight agencies. U.S. Marshal Commander Webb coordinated security for the investigation, ensuring that federal personnel could document constitutional violations without interference from local officials who might have reasons to obstruct justice. The financial consequences for Cumberland County were severe. Federal funding for law enforcement and judicial programs was suspended pending compliance with civil rights requirements. The county faced millions in potential civil rights lawsuit settlements. Vincent used the investigation to highlight systematic problems throughout the region. "What happened to my son happens to thousands of young people every year," he told Congress during oversight hearings. Federal intervention is necessary when local systems consistently violate constitutional rights. The case became a model for federal civil rights enforcement, demonstrating how systematic documentation and swift intervention could transform discriminatory local justice systems. Darius's experience, traumatic as it had been, became the catalyst for protecting countless other young people from similar constitutional violations. 8 months after his wrongful arrest, Darius Blackwell stood before a packed auditorium at Duke University, delivering the keynote address for the school Social Justice Week, his transformation from victim of judicial bias to advocate for criminal justice. Reform had inspired comprehensive changes in how the system treated young defendants. That night in jail taught me that constitutional rights are only as strong as the institutions willing to enforce them. Darius told the audience of law students, civil rights advocates, and criminal justice professionals. "My father's position protected me, but thousands of other young people face the same discrimination without anyone to intervene. His experience had motivated Darius to change his academic focus from pre-law to criminal justice reform, with plans to establish legal aid programs, specifically designed to protect young defendants from prosecutorial overreach and judicial bias. The legal consequences for those who had violated his rights were comprehensive. Judge Chambers was permanently removed from the bench and faced federal criminal charges for systematically violating defendants' constitutional rights under color of law. Prosecutor Ashmore's career ended in disgrace when federal investigators documented her pattern of seeking excessive sentences for minority defendants. Her prosecution of Darius became a textbook example of how prosecutorial misconduct could violate civil rights. Officer Dugan received a 2-year federal sentence for civil rights violations, serving as a warning to law enforcement officers nationwide that discriminatory arrests would face serious federal consequences. Cumberland County had transformed from a symbol of judicial bias into a model for constitutional criminal justice. New procedures ensured that all defendants received adequate representation, and that sentencing decisions were reviewed for potential bias. What happened to Darius exposed problems we had ignored for too long, admitted new District Attorney Carmen Valdez, who had been elected on a reform platform following the federal investigation. We're now committed to ensuring equal justice, regardless of race or economic status. Vincent had used his son's experience to advocate for systematic reforms at the national level. His testimony before Congress led to new legislation, strengthening federal oversight of local justice systems and providing additional resources for constitutional compliance. The federal government has a responsibility to ensure that constitutional rights are protected in every courthouse in America, Vincent told the Senate Judiciary Committee. Local bias cannot be allowed to override federal constitutional guarantees. Civil rights investigator Dr. Lane established new protocols for identifying and addressing systematic bias in local courts, using statistical analysis to detect discrimination patterns before they could affect hundreds of cases. The investigation had broader implications for police training as well. Departments nationwide implemented new procedures specifically designed to prevent the kind of discriminatory arrest that had targeted Darius. Jessica Novak, the public defender who had initially advised accepting a plea deal, underwent additional training and became an advocate for adequate funding of indigent defense services. Her experience with Darius's case had opened her eyes to how systemic underfunding compromised constitutional representation. She learned that being overworked isn't an excuse for providing inadequate representation. Novak reflected during a legal conference. Every defendant deserves zealous advocacy regardless of their ability to pay. The Blackwell family had used their experience to establish a foundation, providing legal support for young people facing discriminatory prosecution. The foundation had already assisted over 150 defendants nationwide. Darius's younger sister, Zoe, inspired by her brother's experience, decided to pursue a career in civil rights law. Watching how the system tried to destroy my brother's future made me realize how important it is to have people fighting for justice, she explained. Most importantly, the systematic changes implemented following Darius's case had protected countless other young people from facing similar discrimination, transforming a personal injustice into lasting institutional reform. 3 years after Judge Chambers attempted to sentence an innocent teenager to 5 years in prison, the Cumberland County Courthouse was rededicated as the Equal Justice Under Law Center, a federal training facility for constitutional criminal justice practices. The transformation symbolized how systematic reform could emerge from individual injustice when proper accountability mechanisms were applied. Darius Blackwell, now a junior at Duke University studying criminal justice reform, returned for the dedication ceremony as a symbol of how the system could be reformed to protect rather than persecute young people. His presence in the courthouse, where he had nearly been railroaded, represented the complete transformation of local justice practices. 3 years ago, this courthouse represented everything wrong with our justice system, Darius told the assembled crowd of federal officials, reformed local authorities, and civil rights advocates. Today, it represents the possibility of equal justice when institutions have the courage to change. Attorney General Vincent Blackwell, now in his final year in the position before accepting a federal judgeship, reflected on how his son's experience had catalyzed nationwide reforms in criminal justice practices. Individual injustice can become systematic change when institutions are held accountable, Vincent explained during his keynote address. What happened to Darius happens to thousands of young people every year, but now we have mechanisms to prevent and address these constitutional violations. The federal monitoring program established in Cumberland County had become a model implemented in 37 districts nationwide, providing real-time oversight of judicial practices and preventing discriminatory sentencing before it could affect defendants' lives. Judge Chambers, completing his federal sentence for civil rights violations, had become an unlikely advocate for judicial accountability through his participation in ethics training programs for new judges. I spent 20 years believing that harsh sentences demonstrated strength, Chambers admitted during a judicial training session. I learned too late that justice requires wisdom, not just authority. The Cumberland County Police Department had achieved national recognition for constitutional policing practices, with their training program being adopted by departments across the region. Officer Duggan, after serving his federal sentence, worked as a civilian instructor, teaching law enforcement personnel about constitutional limitations and the serious consequences of discriminatory arrests. Prosecutor Ashmore's career had ended permanently, but her case became required study material in prosecutor training programs, demonstrating how aggressive prosecution could violate constitutional rights and result in federal criminal charges. The systematic changes extended beyond individual accountability to institutional reform. New statistical monitoring systems made discriminatory patterns immediately visible to oversight agencies, preventing future bias from being hidden in administrative procedures. Public defender offices throughout North Carolina received increased funding and reduced caseloads, ensuring that all defendants would receive adequate constitutional representation, regardless of their economic status. Most significantly, the case had established legal precedents that strengthened federal authority to intervene in local justice systems that violated constitutional rights, protecting future defendants from systematic discrimination. Civil rights investigator Dr. Lane now directed a national program monitoring judicial bias, using advanced statistical analysis to identify discriminatory patterns before they could affect large numbers of defendants. The Blackwell case taught us that federal oversight isn't interference with local authority, it's protection of constitutional rights that local systems sometimes fail to provide. Lane explained, the Equal Justice Under Law Center trained over 500 judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys annually in constitutional criminal justice practices, ensuring that future legal professionals understood both the technical and ethical requirements of their positions. As the dedication ceremony concluded, Vincent and Darius walked through the courthouse together. He passed displays showing the systematic reforms that had emerged from one teenager's wrongful arrest. You know what I'm most proud of? Vincent asked his son. That you stood up for me. Darius suggested. That too, Vincent smiled. But mostly that we used an injustice to create lasting justice for everyone. That judge thought he was teaching you a lesson about knowing your place. Instead, he taught the entire justice system about constitutional accountability. The courthouse that had once symbolized discriminatory justice now served as a beacon of constitutional reform, demonstrating how individual courage combined with institutional accountability could transform systematic injustice into lasting protection for all citizens' rights. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.